How close is too close? I asked it calmly. Melissa Grant reacted like I'd threatened to drive through her garage. Don't touch my car. Her voice cracked across the Maple Grove parking court before I'd even closed the door of my Ford Ranger. I stopped with one boot on the asphalt. It was 5:47 on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd spent 9 hours rewiring a kitchen renovation in 90-degree heat, and my shirt still carried that familiar mixture of drywall dust, copper, and sweat. Melissa came charging down her driveway. White blouse, dark sunglasses pushed into blonde hair. Phone already recording. Behind her sat a spotless white Mercedes GLC. My Ranger was parked beside it. Not touching it. Not blocking it. Just beside it. You need to move, she snapped. I looked between the vehicles. There was enough room for me to stand comfortably between them. Why? You're too close. Too close to what? My car. She said it like the Mercedes had diplomatic immunity. I glanced down. Both vehicles were inside their boundaries. Neither blocked the driveway. Nothing crossed the curb. 2 orange traffic cones stood near the Mercedes, one behind it, and another near the front corner. I'd seen those cones before. I just hadn't understood what they meant yet. Melissa stepped closer and aimed her phone directly at my face. I have asked you repeatedly to respect the safety clearance around my vehicle. Safety clearance? Yes. How much clearance? Her mouth tightened. What? How many feet? That's not the point. Actually, that was exactly the point. I'm an electrician. Measurements matter. Wire gauge matters. Breaker size matters. 3 inches can be the difference between a clean installation and something that fails inspection. So when somebody tells me something is too close, my brain automatically asks the obvious question. Compared to what? Melissa pointed toward my Ranger. You know exactly what you're doing. I parked. You're deliberately intimidating me. That one caught me off guard. With my truck, you keep parking close enough that I can barely access my vehicle. I looked at the gap again, then at her driver's door, then back at Melissa. She was still filming. That was when I understood something. She wasn't trying to solve the problem. She wanted the argument. She wanted me irritated, louder, maybe angry enough to give her phone something useful. So I stopped talking. I walked to the rear passenger door of my Ranger. Melissa followed me with the camera. What are you doing? I opened the door and reached into my work bag. The metal housing of my 25-foot Milwaukee tape measure felt cool in my palm. Click. The yellow blade slid out. Melissa lowered her phone half an inch. What is that supposed to prove? I crouched beside the vehicles and hooked the tape near the edge of the parking boundary. The blade scraped softly across the asphalt. 3 feet. Then farther. Melissa stared down at me. For the first time since she came outside, she wasn't yelling. I looked up. You said I'm too close. I said move your truck. And I asked how close is too close. Her expression hardened. You think you're being clever? No, I locked the tape. Click. I think numbers are harder to argue with. Melissa didn't know it yet, but that little yellow strip of steel was about to become the one thing she couldn't shout into submission. 3 weeks before Melissa Grant started arguing with a tape measure, I thought the orange cones were there for a reason. Construction. Landscaping. Maybe somebody had complained about drainage. Maple Grove Estates was the kind of neighborhood where everything looked intentional. Trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, fresh white parking lines. Even the trash cans seemed to disappear 5 minutes after collection. I'd moved there because I wanted boring. My name is Jack Miller. I was 44, and I'd spent 22 years working as a residential electrician. New construction, remodels, service calls, panel replacements. Most days ended with drywall dust in my hair and little cuts across my knuckles. I like things that could be tested. Voltage, continuity, distance. A wire either carried current or it didn't. A measurement was either right or wrong. People were more complicated. Melissa lived 2 houses down from me. I noticed her white Mercedes before I really noticed her. It was always spotless. Not clean. Spotless. The tires shined. The windows never had fingerprints. I once watched her wipe pollen from the hood before getting inside. And wherever that Mercedes parked, 2 orange cones appeared. One near the front, one near the rear. Sometimes she positioned them wider, creating an invisible rectangle around the vehicle. Nobody questioned it. At least not while Melissa was watching. My neighbor, Paul Harris, explained it one Saturday while I was replacing a porch light. That's Melissa's buffer zone. I looked toward the parking court. Her what? He nodded at the cones. She doesn't like people parking close. How close? Paul laughed. That depends on Melissa. That should have told me everything. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing the pattern. A delivery driver stopped near her Mercedes. Melissa appeared on the porch. A teenager parked beside her. Melissa photographed the license plate. A contractor left his van nearby for 15 minutes. There was a handwritten note under his windshield wiper before he finished unloading. Too close. Please respect resident access. The words sounded official. The paper wasn't. Then I learned Melissa served on the HOA Architectural Committee. That explained the clipboard. It didn't explain the cones. I read the parking rules after Paul mentioned them. Nothing about personal buffer zones. Nothing requiring extra clearance around a resident's vehicle. Nothing giving committee members special parking privileges. Common spaces were common spaces. Simple. Still, most neighbors avoided parking beside Melissa. Not because she was right. Because moving 50 feet was easier than spending 10 minutes listening to her explain why she was right. I understood that. Peace has value. But eventually, somebody who doesn't know the unwritten rule parks in the wrong place. That somebody was me. The first time I parked beside her Mercedes, I came outside the next morning and found a white note beneath my Ranger's windshield wiper. Please maintain safe vehicle clearance. No distance. No rule number. No signature. Just those 5 words. I folded it and put it in my glove compartment. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. What I didn't understand yet was that Melissa wasn't protecting her car. She was protecting an invisible boundary everyone else had agreed to pretend was real. The second note wasn't polite. Move your truck. Black marker. All capital letters. No please this time. I found it under my windshield wiper Monday morning, folded once and pressed so tightly beneath the blade that the paper had curled overnight. My Ranger was parked exactly where I'd left it. Inside the lines. Melissa's Mercedes sat beside me. Inside its lines. There was more than 3 feet between the vehicles. I took a picture of the note and slipped it into my glove compartment beside the first one. 2 days later, I got an email from Maple Grove Management. Parking access complaint. A resident had reported that my vehicle was creating an unsafe obstruction and interfering with reasonable vehicle access. No fine. Just a warning. I read it twice over coffee. Then I replied with one question. What specific parking rule did my vehicle violate? The response came that afternoon. Management had received a complaint and was reviewing the matter. That wasn't an answer. Thursday evening, I came home and found Melissa standing beside her Mercedes photographing my Ranger. She crouched near the rear bumper. Click. Walked toward the passenger side. Click. Stepped backward. Click. You need something? I asked. She lowered the phone. I'm documenting the problem. What problem? You know what problem? I looked at the gap between our vehicles. There it was again. The invisible offense. How much clearance do you think you need? Melissa sighed like I was exhausting her. This is about safety. Then there should be a measurement. Her eyes narrowed. Normal people don't need everything explained in inches. I almost smiled. Electricians do. She didn't find that funny. The next complaint arrived Friday. This time Melissa had added language. Blocked visibility. Restricted emergency access. Unsafe proximity. Every phrase sounded more serious than the last. But still no distance. No covenant section. No actual rule. That weekend, Paul found me near the mailbox. You've made the list. What? List. People Melissa watches. I looked toward her house. 2 orange cones stood beside the Mercedes, widening her private kingdom by several feet. She complains about everyone. Anyone who parks near her. Has the HOA ever fined somebody? Paul shrugged. Most people move before it gets that far. That was the system. Melissa didn't need a written rule if everybody obeyed the unwritten one. Monday evening, I parked in another legal space. She said nothing. Tuesday, that space was occupied when I got home. So I parked beside her again. At 6:12, my doorbell camera caught Melissa walking toward my Ranger. At 6:14, she placed another note beneath the wiper. At 6:19, an email hit my phone. Third documented parking incident. I stood in my kitchen reading it while the air conditioner clicked on overhead. Something about the wording bothered me. Documented. Melissa was building a record, not of violations, of complaints. And if she repeated the same accusation often enough, eventually somebody might stop asking whether it was true. I walked outside. Melissa was still beside her Mercedes, phone in hand, waiting. That was when I realized the next argument wouldn't be accidental. She wanted one. And this time, she wanted it on camera. Melissa was waiting for me to lose my temper. I could see it in the way she held her phone. Not casually. Ready. The camera lens followed me as I crossed the parking court toward my Ranger. You finally got my complaint? She asked. I did. Then you understand this needs to stop. I looked at the truck, then at her Mercedes, then at the 2 orange cones she had positioned around it. What exactly needs to stop? Her phone rose another inch. You deliberately parking close to me. There it was. Deliberately. A motive she could attach to a video. I parked in an open space. You keep saying that because you think rules don't apply to you. I almost answered too quickly. That was what she wanted. The evening was hot enough that I could smell sun-baked asphalt beneath my boots. A sprinkler clicked somewhere behind the townhouses. Melissa stepped closer. You've been warned 3 times. By you. By the HOA. The management company. Said they received a complaint. Her expression sharpened. You're arguing semantics. No. I'm reading words. She gave a short laugh toward her phone. You see how aggressive he gets? That stopped me. My voice hadn't risen. My hands were at my sides. But on her screen, none of the 10 minutes before that moment existed. There would only be whatever Melissa chose to record. I finally understood the game. So I stopped playing. I walked past her. Where are you going? I opened the rear door of my Ranger. Jack, I'm talking to you. My work bag sat behind the passenger seat. I reached inside. When I turned around, the Milwaukee tape measure was in my hand. Melissa stared at it. What are you doing? Measuring. She blinked. What? Click. The yellow blade came out. I hooked it against the painted boundary and stretched it toward the Mercedes. Metal whispered across asphalt. Melissa kept filming. Good. 3 feet. 8 inches, I said. That means nothing. I measured the other side. Then the distance from my rear tire to the line. Then the edge of her Mercedes to the opposite boundary. Each number went into the Notes app on my phone. Melissa's irritation grew with every click. You're being ridiculous. Maybe. I crouched beside the nearest orange cone. It sat well outside the footprint of her Mercedes, narrowing the usable common area. I photographed it. Timestamp visible. Then the second cone. Click. Photograph. Melissa stepped forward. Don't touch those. I'm not. They're there for safety. What's safety requirement? I already explained this. No. You described it. I stood. Dust clung to one knee of my work pants. Show me the rule. Her face flushed. You don't get to interrogate me. I'm not. I retracted the tape. The blade snapped back into its housing with a sharp metallic sound. I'm asking for a number. Melissa lowered her phone. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Not frightened. Cornered. Because anger had been easy for her to dismiss. Measurements weren't. I put the tape back in my work bag and closed the Ranger. From that evening forward, I stopped explaining myself. Every parking position got photographed. Every distance got measured. Every note got saved. Every complaint got printed. Melissa thought her phone was building a case against me. She hadn't realized she was recording the beginning of mine. By Friday night, my kitchen table had become a parking survey. Not officially, but it looked close enough. Printed HOA rules covered one end. Photographs covered the other. Melissa's handwritten notes sat inside clear plastic sleeves beside copies of every complaint management had forwarded to me. And in the middle sat the Milwaukee tape measure. I started with the obvious question. What rule had I actually broken? The Maple Grove parking regulations were 12 pages long. I read every word. Twice. Vehicles had to remain within marked spaces. Mine had. Driveways couldn't be obstructed. Mine hadn't. Fire lanes required clearance. I hadn't parked in one. Nothing required 3 feet beside another vehicle. Nothing required 4. And absolutely nothing required the mysterious safety buffer Melissa kept talking about. The next morning, I went outside before most of the neighborhood was awake. The air smelled like damp grass and somebody's coffee. Click. I measured the width of the parking spaces. Photograph. The distance between painted lines. Photograph. The edge of the common parking area. Photograph. Then I reached Melissa's cones. She had positioned them farther apart than usual. One sat near the front corner of her Mercedes. The second stood several feet behind it. Together, they occupied space that didn't belong exclusively to her. I didn't touch them. I didn't move them. I measured around them. Click. Photograph. Timestamp. Paul Harris walked past carrying a trash bag. You building a case? I'm figuring out whether there is one. He looked at the cones. You know she moves those depending on where people park. That caught my attention. Seriously? Paul nodded. If somebody gets close, suddenly her safety zone gets bigger. I wrote that down. Monday afternoon, management finally sent me the parking diagram I'd requested. I printed it in color. Common use parking. No reserve buffer. No special architectural committee clearance. No 6-foot zone around a white Mercedes. Then I noticed something better. One of Melissa's own complaint photos showed my Ranger parked legally inside the lines. Her Mercedes was inside its space too. But the orange cone behind her vehicle extended into the shared access area. I enlarged the image. There it was. Her photograph. Her timestamp. Her cone. I didn't need to accuse her of anything. She had documented it herself. So I changed tactics. I sent one email. No anger. No explanation. Just one sentence. Please identify the exact minimum vehicle clearance you contend I am required to maintain. Melissa replied 43 minutes later. Her answer was longer than my question. She wrote about safety, emergency access, community standards, respect for neighboring property. But buried near the bottom was finally a number. 6 feet. I leaned back in my chair. 6 feet. There it was. The invisible boundary finally had a measurement. I searched the rules again. Nothing. I searched the amendments. Nothing. Then I emailed management. Please provide the section establishing a 6-foot clearance requirement between privately owned vehicles in common parking spaces. Their response came the next morning. We are unable to locate such a requirement in the governing documents. I printed that email, slid it into a plastic sleeve, then placed it directly behind Melissa's message. Her claim, their answer, side by side. For weeks, Melissa had been trying to turn her preference into a rule. All I had done was ask her to put a number on it. And the moment she wrote 6 feet, the argument stopped being about how she felt. Now it could be measured. Melissa made her biggest mistake at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning. She put the imaginary rule in writing. I was inside a half-finished kitchen installing recessed lights when my phone vibrated against the plywood countertop. An email. Melissa had copied the property manager and 2 HOA board members. Her message began with the usual language. Safety. Resident access. Repeated non-compliance. Then came something new. The 6-foot vehicle clearance requirement has been approved through the Architectural Committee and applies to common parking areas adjacent to residential access points. I read that sentence twice. Then I smiled. Not because I'd caught her, because she had finally given me something measurable. I waited until lunch. Then I replied, please provide the meeting date and minutes documenting approval of the 6-foot requirement. Nothing else. Melissa responded 9 minutes later. The committee is not required to justify every safety standard to individual residents. That wasn't a meeting date, so I emailed management directly. By 4 that afternoon, I had a response. They could locate no amendment, board resolution, committee record, or published parking standard establishing a 6-foot vehicle clearance requirement. I printed everything when I got home. Melissa's claim, management's answer, the parking diagram, the governing rules. Then I placed them in order across my kitchen table. Claim, rule, evidence. That was how I worked electrical problems. You didn't argue with a dead circuit. You tested it. The next morning, another complaint arrived. This one included 6 photographs Melissa had taken herself. I opened the attachments. Photo 1 showed my Ranger inside the painted lines. Photo 2 showed her Mercedes beside it. Photo 3 was taken from behind both vehicles. I zoomed in, then stopped. The orange cone. It sat behind Melissa's Mercedes, several feet beyond the end of her parking position and partly inside the shared maneuvering area. I opened Photo 4. Same thing from another angle. Photo 5 was even better. Both cones were visible. One at the front, one behind. Melissa had created the very obstruction she claimed my Ranger was causing, and she had time-stamped it for me. I downloaded the originals, saved copies, printed the clearest image. Then I took my tape measure outside. Click. The yellow blade stretched from the painted boundary to the cone position shown in Melissa's photograph. I recorded the distance. Photograph. Timestamp. No touching. No moving anything. Just measurement. Paul watched from his driveway. You enjoying this? No, he looked disappointed. I laughed. Okay, maybe a little. That afternoon, management notified me that Melissa had requested a formal compliance hearing. I read the message. Standing beside my Ranger. Across the parking court, Melissa was wiping the hood of her Mercedes with a microfiber cloth. 2 orange cones guarded it like sentries. She looked over. Our eyes met. Then she smiled. She thought the hearing would force me to defend why I kept parking too close. She still believed the argument was about my truck. It wasn't anymore. It was about 6 feet that existed nowhere except inside one email. An authority nobody had approved. And photographs Melissa herself had submitted showing exactly who was occupying the common area. I opened my Ranger and set the Milwaukee tape measure on top of my binder. Click. The housing snapped shut. For weeks, Melissa had been asking the HOA to look at the evidence. Now they were going to. All of it. The photograph Melissa thought would prove everything was the one she should never have sent. I noticed it Wednesday night. I was sitting at my kitchen table with her latest complaint open on my laptop. The room quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. 6 attachments. I had already reviewed them twice. Then I opened photo 5 again. Melissa had taken it from the sidewalk behind our vehicles. My dark blue Ranger sat inside the white parking lines. Her Mercedes sat inside the space beside it. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. Then I zoomed in. Orange. One cone stood behind her Mercedes. The second was near the front passenger corner. I enlarged the photograph until the pixels softened. The rear cone wasn't protecting her vehicle. It was sitting beyond her parking footprint, inside the shared maneuvering area. And Melissa had included it in her own evidence. I opened the parking diagram beside the photograph. Then my measurements. Then another one of her pictures. Same cone. Same position. Different angle. I leaned back. For weeks, Melissa had claimed my Ranger restricted access. But her own photographs showed that she was deliberately reducing the usable common space around her Mercedes. I didn't need to prove she was lying about everything. I only needed the board to look at what she had submitted. The next morning, I emailed management. I asked them to preserve Melissa's original complaint attachments exactly as received. Then I requested one more thing. The Architectural Committee meeting minutes covering the previous 12 months. They arrived Friday afternoon. 47 pages. I searched every page. Parking. Clearance. Vehicle access. 6 feet. Nothing. Melissa's name appeared several times. Paint colors. Fence materials. A patio enclosure. Not one discussion about creating a special clearance zone around parked vehicles. That evening, another email arrived from Melissa. She had copied management again. The 6-foot safety requirement has always been understood and enforced by the committee. Always. That word made me smile. First it had been a safety expectation, then a requirement, then an approved committee standard. Now it had apparently always existed. I replied with one sentence. Please identify one documented instance where this 6-foot rule was formally adopted or enforced before my arrival. She didn't answer. Saturday morning, I found Melissa beside her Mercedes. No phone this time. Just sunglasses and folded arms. You think you're going to embarrass me at this hearing? I think the board is going to read the documents. You've turned a simple courtesy issue into some kind of investigation. No, I looked at the orange cones. You turned courtesy into a rule. Her jaw tightened. You could have just parked somewhere else. There it was. The first honest thing she'd said in weeks. She didn't need 6 feet. She wanted 6 feet. Those were different things. I opened my Ranger and reached for the tape measure. Melissa watched me. Click. The yellow blade stretched across the asphalt. I measured from the painted line to the rear cone, then photographed it. She shook her head. You're obsessed. I retracted the blade. No, Melissa. Click. I'm specific. Monday morning, the hearing notice arrived. Thursday, 7 p.m. Maple Grove Clubhouse. Melissa would present her complaint first. I printed the notice and placed it at the front of my binder. Behind it went her photographs. Behind those, the parking diagram. Then the committee minutes. Then her email claiming 6 feet. I closed the binder. Melissa had spent weeks creating evidence. The only mistake she made was assuming it belonged to her. 6 feet, Melissa said. That is the rule. She said it with enough confidence to make 3 people around the clubhouse table look down at their paperwork. I didn't. I looked at Melissa. Thursday night, 7:06 p.m. The Maple Grove Clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. 11 residents had shown up, along with 3 board members and the property manager. Melissa sat across from me in a cream blazer, her complaint folder arranged neatly in front of her. My binder stayed closed. For now, Board President Robert Hayes nodded toward Melissa. Please explain the issue. She did. For 8 straight minutes. My Ranger was too close. I had ignored warnings. I had restricted access to her Mercedes. I had created a safety concern. Then she repeated the phrase I'd been waiting for. Residents are required to maintain 6 feet of vehicle clearance. Robert looked at the property manager. Is that in the parking rules? Melissa answered before he could. It was approved through the architectural committee. I opened my binder. Plastic sleeves whispered in the quiet room. Can I ask one question? Robert nodded. I slid a copy of Melissa's email across the table. Is this the 6-foot requirement you're referring to? Melissa barely glanced at it. Yes. Good. I placed the HOA parking regulations beside it. Can you show me where it appears here? She frowned. It's a committee standard. I placed 47 pages of committee minutes on the table. Then show me where it was adopted. Silence. Melissa looked toward the property manager. He cleared his throat. We were unable to locate any formal adoption of a 6-foot clearance requirement. Her face changed. Only slightly. But I saw it. That doesn't mean it wasn't understood. I nodded. Then came the parking diagram. Common use spaces. No buffer zones. Then my measurements. Dates. Distances. Photographs. Every image showed my Ranger inside the painted boundaries. Melissa crossed her arms. This is obsessive. Maybe. I reached into my work bag. Click. The Milwaukee tape measure landed on the table. But measurements are useful. Someone near the back laughed quietly. Melissa's eyes hardened. I pulled out her photograph. The one she should never have sent. I placed it in front of Robert. Who took this? Melissa hesitated. I did. And submitted it as evidence. Yes. I pointed at the orange cone behind her Mercedes. Then what is that? She stared at the photograph. A safety cone. Where is it? Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. I placed the parking diagram beside the photo. The cone sat outside her vehicle's parking footprint, inside the shared maneuvering area. Then I showed the second photograph. Both cones visible. Same problem. Robert leaned forward. So Mr. Miller's vehicle is within the marked space, but your cones extend into common use access? Melissa's cheeks flushed. They protect my vehicle. That wasn't the question. The room went quiet. 10 minutes later, the board dismissed every complaint against me. Then they instructed Melissa to stop using cones to create a personal buffer zone in common parking. No 6-foot rule. No special clearance. No invisible territory. Melissa gathered her papers without looking at me. As she stood, I retracted the tape measure. Click. That sound had started our argument. Now it ended it. Melissa spent weeks demanding 6 feet of space she never owned. In the end, 6 feet was exactly what proved she had never owned it. 1 week later, I came home and saw something missing. Orange. For the first time since I'd moved into Maple Grove, there wasn't a single traffic cone around Melissa Grant's white Mercedes. No homemade buffer zone. No invisible boundary. Just a car sitting between 2 painted lines like everybody else's. I slowed my Ranger. The space beside her was empty. The same kind of space that had started the whole mess. Melissa was standing on her front porch with a coffee mug in one hand. She saw me. I saw her. And for about 2 seconds, I considered pulling in. Not too close. Not illegally. Just close enough to make a point. Then I laughed at myself and kept driving. There was another open space, 20 feet away. I parked there. When I stepped out, Melissa was still watching. I reached behind the seat for my tool bag. The Milwaukee tape measure sat on top. I left it there. I didn't need it anymore. The board sent its written decision 2 days later. Every complaint involving my Ranger was dismissed. Management clarified the parking policy for the entire community. Vehicles had to remain within marked spaces and avoid blocking designated access areas. That was it. No 6 feet. No personal safety buffer. And no resident could use cones, signs, or other objects to reserve additional common parking without authorization. The email was boring. Beautifully boring. Paul Harris caught me at the mailbox that Saturday. So what happens now? Hopefully nothing. He grinned. You went through all that, and you don't want to enjoy it. I looked toward Melissa's Mercedes. A pickup was parked beside it. Maybe 4 feet away. Melissa walked past both vehicles carrying groceries. She looked at the pickup. Stopped. For half a second, I expected the phone to come out. It didn't. She kept walking. That, I told Paul, is me enjoying it. What surprised me most was how quickly Maple Grove changed once everyone knew the actual rule. People stopped avoiding that side of the parking court. Contractors unloaded without finding notes on their windshields. Visitors parked wherever legal spaces were available. Nobody celebrated. Nobody needed to. The absence of Melissa's cones said enough. A few days later, She and I crossed paths near the mailboxes. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. You could have handled this privately, she said. I tried. You made me look ridiculous. I shook my head. No, Melissa. I asked how close was too close. She looked away. You picked 6 feet. That ended the conversation. That evening, I opened my Ranger to grab a screwdriver. The tape measure was still sitting in the work bag. Yellow housing scratched from years of jobs. Nothing special. Just 25 feet of marked steel. But every line on that blade meant something, because everyone agreed what the numbers meant. That was the part Melissa never understood. Rules work the same way. They don't become real because somebody says them louder. They don't become official because somebody puts them in an email. And they don't belong to whoever carries the most confident clipboard. Melissa spent weeks fighting for 6 feet of space she never owned. In the end, the distance between our cars wasn't what mattered. The distance between preference and authority was. And once we measured that, her invisible boundary disappeared.